10 minutes for rebuttal.
All right. Well, I'm going to try to address all of his arguments. We'll see how much time I have and how fast I can move through this. First, let's talk about God world. But I do want to say, and I mentioned this to somebody before, that I do appreciate Justin's arguments in the sense that they are not the arguments that I normally hear from non-Christians of really any kind. Usually it's just poking fun at what Christians believe or tearing down Christian arguments rather than constructing their own. So I do appreciate Justin's ability to construct some arguments to give this conversation some depth. So to begin, let's address this question of God and God world. If God is indeed the greatest possible being that could possibly exist, and I agree with J.P. Moreland, of course, it's the very thing that makes him God, right? The fact that he is who he is. But the idea of God world suggests that because God is such a being, that he would have no sufficient reason to create anything because it really can't compare to who he is. Well, there's a couple problems I see with this. Well, first, I think it makes an assumption that if God existed, he would not have created anything else. It's really no more than an assumption on who God is, the character of a God, in terms of what we think God might or might not want to create. If God is a maximally great being, then it seems to me that he has the freedom to create what he chooses, so long as it doesn't contradict with his character. Second, we have no reason to believe that God must create or want to create something as unique and as perfect as he is. In fact, to be God, he cannot. The very thing that makes him God is that his creation must be less than he is, not greater than or certainly equal to him. Otherwise, that thing would be called God in some way, shape, or form. A part of God being maximally great is that he is infinite and we are finite. His creation is finite. There exists a distinction between creator and creation. Further, God created what he wanted, and it doesn't have to be the best possible world, only the world that God wants to create. Justin also states that a world that God creates needs to have all the same great-making properties to the same degree, at least that's the way I understand it. He further argues, and I don't know if he said this tonight, but this is a quote from one of his other debates on his website. A world composed entirely of the single best possible being existing alone for eternity would be a world composed entirely of all those great-making properties to their maximal composable degrees, and no such property to a lesser degree. Now again, while God did not create the world equal to him or to the full capacity of his great-making properties, much of the world is designed to reflect God and his nature. God is the most loving being possible, giving humanity the capacity to love. God is the most intelligent being possible, giving humanity the ability to think, create, and innovate. God is the most moral being possible, giving humanity a standard for morality. While creation can't match all of God's great-making properties, we certainly possess them in a way that's reflective. He's also said in the past, I don't think he said it tonight, but unless there is some source of unique goodness that exists outside of and fully independent of God, then God world must be the unique best possible world. But again, this is missing the nature and character of God. The unique source of goodness cannot exist independently of God, because God is the source. If God is the means by which the world came into existence, then any standard of goodness that we experience has its origin in God himself. Therefore, although incredibly interesting, and I appreciate the argument, I don't believe that God world could really exist in any kind of reality whatsoever, and therefore, since we're talking about the universe as it stands now, I believe these premises really don't stand. Let's talk about problem of evil. For purposes tonight, I want to have a point of significant agreement. I certainly agree that many evils are gratuitous, they're unnecessary. But for tonight, what I want to kind of offer is the idea that that's a bit of a subjective viewpoint. Because when we're talking about suffering, generally we're talking about something very deep and very personal to each and every one of us in whatever capacity. And there could be any one of us at any time experiencing an evil or an aspect of suffering that we might think is gratuitous, that we might think is unnecessary. So I want to kind of address that as a kind of a whole thing and just say, you know what, they all could be, based on where we are in our current life and what's going on. And I think that's something we should all appreciate in each other. So I completely exist, obviously, that evil exists. And it exists that many times it seems as though it's unnecessary. And I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that, well, God has a plan for your life and maybe we just don't know it yet. I'm not going to make that assertion because I don't know that I can show that. And that's not for tonight. But I will say that according to philosopher and professor at Notre Dame, Alvin Plantinga, if a person is free with respect to a particular action, then he has the freedom to perform that action as well as the freedom to refrain from performing that action. And there's no previous condition or cause that determines the choice. See, God could not have created creatures with the free ability to only choose good. Without the ability to choose evil, how do we know what is good? Our finite minds, even though reflective of God, still need to understand a standard or origin for good and evil. Well, therefore, evil is allowed to exist so that we can be truly free creatures. Plantinga states it this way, and I quote, "A world containing creatures who are significantly free is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all. They do not do what is right freely. To create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. As it turned out, sadly enough, some of the free creatures God created went wrong in their exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness. For he could not have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good," end quote. I think in this case, whether evil and suffering possesses a divine point really is, I say this gently, irrelevant. What is relevant is that evil and suffering of every kind exists. Mankind's exercise in their freedom has caused evil, and in order to maintain this freedom, God must allow and consequently deal with it as the sole authority and judge for moral behavior. Based on God's ability and need to create morally free creatures and his responsibility to hold his creation to a standard of morality, illustrates clearly that God is in fact a being who is acting in a way that is morally just because he's morally perfect, and therefore God exists. Let me touch just for a minute on his last argument, the divine lie, whatever you want to exactly call it. If I understand it correctly, and Justin, you can correct me if I'm way off for some reason or another, that Justin is stating that the Christians have really no way of knowing whether God is lying to us or not in the Bible. And as a result, there's really a great possibility or probability that he is. That we can't really know what God's up to. God's greater than we are, so how are we supposed to know? Well, I can agree in part with his premise 1 and his premise 2. God does, in fact, have complete knowledge of good and evil and the entanglement relationships between them. Absolutely. I also agree that in many cases our finite minds do not have the capacity to understand good and evil and to the degree that God does, certainly. What does not seem to follow is the assumption that God is somehow lying or somehow not telling us the truth, that we somehow cannot know these things. There's just as much of a probability of him telling the truth as there is of him lying, and therefore I'm not sure the argument holds. Further, I think this is applying or a simple misunderstanding of the nature of the Christian God. When we speak of God as maximally great being, this includes God's inability to lie, which the scriptural promise of redemption hinges on this fact. Lastly, the scriptures are reliable. This means that we know something about God beyond general revelation. We know it through the biblical account. Speaking of the New Testament specifically, we have a greater number, more accurate and reliable accounts of the life of Jesus and the early church activities and beliefs than any other document in antiquity. In other words, the information we have in the New Testament documents is accurate and reliable more so than any other historical document of its time. So in combination with extra biblical accounts of Jesus and his resurrection, the Bible gives us excellent reasons to know that God is telling the truth, that his promises are in fact coming true, and that we have good reason to believe so. So to prove that what Mr. Schieber needs to do is to provide his own examples of the fact that God is in fact lying and that we have no good reasons to believe that of what God is doing beyond our understanding. Until he does that, I don't think his argument can be considered. Thank you.
All right, 10 minutes. All right. Now, in his opening statement, Mr. Kozak provided us with 3 arguments for the existence of God. Let's examine them in the order that they were presented. So, his first argument, if you recall, was a kind of cosmological argument. Everything that comes into existence has an originating cause that explains its existence. The universe began to exist, and the conclusion, therefore, the universe has an originating cause that is eternal, all-powerful, and personal. I want to suggest that premise 1 is an interesting claim. On the one hand, it seems obviously true, right? Everything that starts to exist does so for a reason, right? Well, that depends on what exactly you mean by come into existence. For example, a chair comes into existence in the sense that it was built from pre-existing materials. Chairs don't just pop into existence. They're crafted over time, and then at one point, it is a particular way that it deserves a new label, a chair. It doesn't just pop into existence. Everything we know about things coming into existence tells us that they come into existence from pre-existing material reality. That's just an empirical claim. And so if the move from premise 1 to premise 2 in this argument is inferring from the general to the particular, then we should conclude that the universe's existence came about from a causally prior, primitive form of material reality, perhaps a spaceless, timeless point, or a quantum field. People like Quentin Smith have argued that the universe does come from a spaceless, timeless point. Now, if this is the inference being made here, then I really don't have any problem with that. I don't really see how that could possibly justify the conclusion to the argument. But I would have no problems with the premises as stated. However, given Stephen's presentation of premise 2, he seems to have an implicit assumption that there was nothing before this point, or that it came from it wasn't created like a chair is out of material reality. Rather, it was created out of nothing, and that begs for an explanation, and so we would have a transcendent reality causing that thing to come into existence out of nothing. But this conclusion looks more like theology rather than a conclusion based in science. The most scientists can say about the beginning of the universe is that our space-time universe cannot have been expanding infinitely into the past. But think about it, this does not entail that the universe had a beginning of its very existence, only that its period of expansion had a beginning. It might be that the universe, for example, had an initial timeless state, and perhaps that timeless state exists necessarily. The truth is we just don't know these things, and to kind of speculate about the beginning of the universe, I think, is not only scientifically troublesome, but philosophically, it just seems to violate just good, rigorous philosophical thought. Like I said, we just don't know. For example, general relativity, the theory underlying the Big Bang theory, we know it's incomplete. We don't have an understanding of quantum gravity yet. So anything described by general relativity before the first Planck second, we should really be treating as an unknown. I think we're just not really justified in kind of coming up with these grand theories. So the conclusion of the argument, the universe has an originating cause that is eternal, all-powerful, and personal. I just don't see how this follows from the argument. Maybe I'm missing something, but I just don't see how that follows. As theoretical physicist at Caltech, Sean Carroll put it, quote, "The singularity of the Big Bang does not indicate a beginning to the universe. It only indicates an end to our theoretical comprehension." The moral argument. If objective moral values do not exist, then God does not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. First of all, before I address what I think Stephen is arguing here, I think it should be noted that the argument is invalid and therefore unsound. The conclusion does not follow from the premises. Nothing about the claim that a lack of moral values entails a lack of God means that the existence of moral values entails the existence of God. This is a formal fallacy called denying the antecedent. But I think I know what Mr. Kozak is trying to get at here. And I think you do too. Among some moral issues, there seems to be a wide moral agreement. And in many cases, these moral positions were reached independently of others. For instance, charity is very good, torture is very bad. Now, if we grant the premise that this can be a good guide to truth, then the independent attestation is, I think, strong evidence in favor of some form of moral realism. How best are we to make sense of this, though? Stephen Kozak seems to be arguing that the God of the Bible is the only suitable ontological grounding, or at least the most plausible, more plausible than not, ontological grounding for the existence of these moral facts. But think about this. Clearly the claim which asserts that these obvious moral facts are grounded in the biblical God, or are grounded in anything rather, at the very least must be sensitive to whether or not the entity you're positing acts in a way consistent with those moral values that we all hold dear. Now, the God of the Bible commands the genocide of men, women, and children simply because their ancestors attacked Israel on the way out of Egypt 400 years prior to that. I'm talking about the Amalekite genocide. Saul failed in his job to exterminate the Amalekites. And so God wasn't happy with him. He didn't kill enough men, women, and children. And so he lost his job. Saul was no longer there. And so that's when Israel erected the monarchy. So think about this. This is the claim we're being told to think about, that what makes sense of our moral intuitions is a being who is capable of that. Now let me ask you, if a being being good is consistent with commanding such things as that, and with permitting slavery, and not outlawing it, but rather just regulating it, if that's really consistent with what goodness is, then I'm sorry, I have no idea what the hell goodness means anymore. And I don't think any of you do either. Sometimes I'm just baffled at these claims. What does it mean to say that God plausibly grounds moral values if he proudly and boastfully violates them at seemingly every moment he has available to him in the Old Testament? Argument 3. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. This was an abductive argument, in which he listed 3 main facts, and says that the best explanation of these 3 facts is that how much time do I got? All right. That the best explanation of these 3 facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, on page 222 of Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ, one of the very first apologetic books I ever owned, we read, William Lane Craig is quoted as saying, quote, "Any hypothesis would be more probable than saying that the corpse of Jesus spontaneously came back to life. But the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead doesn't contradict science or any known facts of experience." And listen to what he says here. This is extremely important. All it requires is the hypothesis that God exists. And I think there are good independent reasons for thinking that he does. Now, Craig is certainly right that the plausibility of the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead will, of course, hinge on whether or not there are strong independent reasons for God's existence. If you're like me and you feel that the arguments for God's existence are extremely weak, then obviously any even far-fetched naturalistic explanation is just going to be a better explanation. Now notice, though, that this is not dogmatic. this is not a dogmatic rejection of miracles. Rather, it's a recognition that one's epistemic probability of a hypothesis is going to be sensitive to one's background knowledge. That is to say that the plausibility of the resurrection to me is of course going to be contingent on whether or not I think that a God exists, or whether or not there are supernatural agents interacting with the world in such a way as to yeah, thanks. I'm terrible at things.
All right. All right. Now, what I think is going to be my favorite part, the cross-examination.
All right, Steve, you have 8 minutes for your cross-examination, and it begins now.
All right. Well, I want to start with just maybe some clarification questions to make sure I'm understanding some things correctly. Can you help me with the connection that you make between who God is in terms of character? Because it does seem very much like in your first argument from non-God objects that much of what you're asserting is more directed at God's character, who you think God might be, or what he might want to do, versus what he is able to do. Now, that could be just my misunderstanding. But can you make that connection between who God is in your mind based on this argument and his need and desire to only have this world in which he's the only thing or entity that exists rather than create anything at all?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the argument, as with anything when we talk about maximally great beings, as you're aware, the ontological argument, we feel, or philosophical theologians feel perfectly within their rights to put some flesh on these claims, right? So a morally good being, a morally perfect being rather, would be a being who kind of fulfills those things that we all kind of intuit as moral perfections in each other. And we kind of extrapolate those and be like, well, a person who's like this is like God, or God would be like that because that's just something that humanity could never aspire to, but we still think of that as a noble goal. And so I think that appealing to intuitions like this is a perfectly legitimate way to flesh out what we could think of God as plausibly doing, if it's the case that we're going to allow the same thing to people who are using arguments like the ontological argument. So, given that, the claim that God would never want to create anything, that's a claim about God preferring the quality of the state of affairs rather than the quantity. So, by introducing anything that's not God, of course, anything that's not maximally extended would be to degrade the overall quality. And I don't think a good God would do that. I think a perfect God would preserve the pure quality rather than introducing new numbers of properties, bringing down the overall quality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what I'm wondering is, and this is going to sound bad to some people in the room, but I hate to bring theology into it too much. But I do want to see what your response would be to maybe the Christian response to that beyond an apologetics discussion might be, well, God did create what we might call the best possible world, and in terms of Genesis, Adam and Eve, the garden, in terms of even how Christians understand heaven being the presence of God, that would be as close to or as like heaven as one could get before the end of all things, according to the Christian view. That God did create that, but in order to create morally free creatures, he has to create them with the ability to do wrong. Therefore they did, therefore they have the punishment, therefore we're in our state now. How then would you respond to the basic Christian response to that?
Sure. Well, I guess first of all I would say, well, then God would create other things that are like God. Of course, the only difference being that they wouldn't be necessary beings, they'd be contingent beings. But it wouldn't make any sense for God to create human beings who are limited in knowledge. Like, why would he need to limit them in knowledge? If the value of things is what's important to God, then God would make their great-making properties of knowledge to their infinite degrees, to their maximal degrees, their power to their maximal degrees.
But doesn't that make them God, and then no longer can God
Well,
be
what's
God?
the problem with that? Why not more God properties, right? Like, I think that there's a theological assumption that God needs to kind of be boastful and keep everyone away from him and like I just think
say,
that's
yeah, I see what you're saying.
anachronistic.
I wouldn't say keep everything away from him, but in terms
Keep
of
everything lesser than us.
defining who God is, something so much greater than we are, that there is that creator, creation,
Right.
kind of thing. So in order for him to be defined, in terms of if we're talking about God, in terms of defining who God is, then we have to maintain that definition of a maximally great being, something greater than ourselves, so that way, no matter how much knowledge he gives us, it can never be his knowledge.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Well, in that case, I would say then I would remain with the arguments and say that he wouldn't create anything, because then only then would the state of affairs be absolutely pure godliness. In fact, it would be the most godly state of affairs that is even possible.
Okay. Let's jump to your final argument. How do you assert then that we don't have, or we don't know any, proposition that has biblical justification, if I read your premises correctly?
Right. So what I was arguing there is in response to a particular response to the problem of evil, in which one says that, look, we're not in a position to place probabilities on what God would or wouldn't allow, right? Now, if that's the case, then it will also follow that we're not in a position to place probabilities on whether or not there exists a good that would justify God's lying. Now, the argument isn't saying that God has lied. It's only saying that the probability is completely beyond us. Because of the vast epistemic chasm that exists between God's knowledge and man's knowledge. Given that, we're just simply not in a position to place probabilities on whether or not some particular biblical passages are lies. Now, of course, if that's the case, then we can't be justified in thinking that they're probably true. And so it means that we can't know them because we wouldn't have justification for them, or we wouldn't have warrant for them.
So I guess the part that I take exception to then is the idea of adding in that, the possibility that God is lying. Because if we are not sure, which we could say that in many cases, especially when it comes to ideas of suffering, that there's no way we can look in the Bible and go, oh, this suffering is here. Okay, well then this is what I'm supposed to. This is how I'm supposed to react.
Right.
Certainly, there's a lot of instances we can't do that. Well, then aren't we just as much? Isn't it like a 50-50 chance that either God is either telling the truth or he's lying? So I guess the part that I'm taking issue with and I'm looking for further clarification is
Sure.
Why add in the lying piece of it when it's really a 50-50 shot?
Well, I don't think that it's 50-50, though. I don't think that we're in a position to place probabilities, as I was saying. So to place probabilities, one would have to assume that our knowledge of the goods, evils, and entanglement relationships that exist between them is roughly representative of those that actually exist, right? Only if that is the case can we really be confident in placing probabilities on these things. So I don't think that we're in a position to say 50-50.
I'll stop there because I'm not going to have time for that question. So.
All right, now, oops, sorry, one second. Okay, so now things are going to get reversed. It was asking me to update the stopwatch app.
This is current enough.
Yeah, and wait.
All right.
Justin, you have 8 minutes to cross-examine.
Okay. All right. I may have misheard this. Tell me if I'm correct here. Did you at one point say in your response to the God would not create anything argument? Did you say that that the God world would never really exist? That God would always create something because of his nature, or something like that?
That sounds close enough. I'm not sure exactly where that was, but that basic idea that because what I'm looking at there is that we can talk about the existence of a God world, but what I would rather talk about, what I think is more relevant to talk about, is the fact that we have something. So I would rather almost explain this existence now rather than go into the possibility of some other universe or some other situation in which God chose to create nothing except for leave himself to hang out and do his thing.
Sure. So if you're saying that creation was necessary, then are you saying that creation was not a free act?
No, I'm not saying creation was necessary. I'm saying
God
just he desired to.
Okay.
God does not need us in any capacity whatsoever.
Sure.
So.
Okay, so in the response to the evidential problem of evil that I presented, my second argument, you had responded by saying that there are many gratuitous evils. Is that right?
The point I was trying to make there is that we can maybe make the assumption that any one of us in this room might assert that a particular evil is gratuitous because in our own experience at that moment,
Sure.
we might feel that way.
Yeah. So definitely, I obviously I would agree that a lot of these evils seem gratuitous, right? And when I say gratuitous, I'm talking about an instance of suffering or an evil is gratuitous if and only if God could have prevented it without missing out on some greater good or avoiding some greater evil. And so I guess what I'm saying then is that if you agree that gratuitous evil exists, you agree that God doesn't prevent evils really for any reason, like he does, as in God doesn't need a good reason to prevent an evil. He can just play hands off and not care about the justifying goods.
Okay, yeah. Let me clarify. See what you're saying.
Okay.
So my first comment in terms of we can feel as though these evils are gratuitous because we may never know in some larger scheme of things what is actually happening behind the scenes. So it may seem for years, why did my aunt get cancer or why whatever. But God's action within the world is obviously his free choice to do what he needs to do based on his will, based on what he desires to do. Evils which are allowed to exist.
Right.
And the common Christian theological answer would be, well, God allows evil so it gives a chance for Christians to be compassionate and all those wonderful things. Which, okay, fine, but the basic thing that I'm trying to show is that these evils must exist in order for us to have any kind of idea of what good is.
Okay.
If we assume the knowledge, if we assume something's evil, we're assuming we have a standard to which to compare, which means we have good. If we have good, then we have a standard which we compare to see that things are good. Therefore, we need some kind of giver of that good, and therefore. And
Sure. So then under that definition that I gave of gratuitous evil, you would accept that there are no gratuitous evils because the sufferings that we endure, God only permits them because of the greater good of our coming to know the moral standard.
I don't think it's that simple on either a
Or
black or white.
That's a plausible answer, but there's a reason why God's letting these things happen. He's not just saying, whatever. He's allowing these terrible things to happen to these people, but it's okay even if they don't understand it because it's justified by some other thing that God knows about.
We would justify it under God's grand scheme of things, yes.
Okay. All right. And you had, in response to my last argument, you had said that God does not lie. That is the Christian belief that, of course, that Scripture is absolutely true. That God does not lie. That it's part of the Christian belief that He has an inability to lie. Actually, presumably you would refer to like Titus or something that says, it is impossible for God to lie. What I'm curious though is if God is the inspiration to the biblical text, and He is lying, and He put in the lie that He can't lie. That's what I'm wondering, is that you can't really use that to justify the Christian belief that God can't lie without begging the question.
No, absolutely. I totally agree. You can't use Scripture to justify Scripture. That doesn't work.
Okay.
Anytime I'm justifying the use of Scripture, it's the manuscript evidence in the New Testament that shows that it is what we could consider roughly 6,000 manuscripts closer to date to its original than any other document in antiquity of its kind.
Right. Which just means there was a lot of copiers, right?
A lot of copiers, and they're all 95 to 99% accurate to each other. Yeah.
Right. I would only. Let me. I guess talk of the resurrection argument. So, what do I want to say? So you had talked about free will being a great good that could be a plausible reason for why God would create things, and presumably why God would allow moral suffering between humans. One question I would like to know is, do you think that there exists free will in heaven?
Yeah, I'll say this much, heaven's a tricky thing because if we were to look at Scripture itself, we don't have a whole lot of information on what heaven's like. And I know there's a lot of Christians out there that like to speculate on what heaven's like, and there's a ton of books. Every person that has a near-death experience has a book on what that was like. And that's wonderful. I think that's great. But if we take it directly from Scripture, we don't really know how that operates. And I'm not going to, I could sit here and speculate. We could, talk theologically until the cows come home. But really, at the end of the day, we're going to say, I don't know.
Sure. So I don't know. I guess it's a plausible assumption that Christians believe that there is no sin in heaven. Would you say yes to that?
We would say there's no sin in heaven, and then theologically speaking, new heavens, new earth, when God recreates everything, then
right, and those
no
there as well.
sin.
Correct. So I guess the point I'm making is that if there is free will in heaven, then of course God doesn't need to allow sin in order for people to be acting perfectly and to have free will, right? Because it's not as though the world is logically necessary to create heaven. I guess we're done.
Yeah, you had 4 good seconds there.
We can continue that question.